Welcome to Unregistered Live, the official live stream of Unregistered Academy. To check out our courses and what's going on at the Academy, go to unregisteredacademy.com. The link is in the description. Tonight, I will be discussing just a few pieces or elements of our upcoming course, which will begin next Tuesday, Postmodernism, an Introduction. Now, this is a course and an issue and a topic that has been violently controversial, I would say, since I first introduced it into the podcast sphere on the Joe Rogan podcast now 8 years ago. I have never received more criticism for anything I've said than my suggestions about the contingency of truth than I did when I raised that on Rogan's podcast. Even just this week, I think a video was released on YouTube attacking me for what I said. I haven't seen the video, but I saw something about it. But yeah, no, I have heard about this almost every day since I first went public with those ideas. And what was interesting, well, there were many things that were interesting about it. One was that I was completely taken by surprise at how controversial it was. I did not expect that one bit. In fact, and I do ask people to go watch the entire section in which I'm discussing this with Joe. Usually it's just limited to this one tiny clip, but it was a full discussion, and I led him with a pretty detailed argument about how contingent ideas about gender are across time and across space, that historically people have thought very, very differently about what a man is, what a woman is, what an adult is, what a child is, and also across space, that even today in various countries across the world, there are very different definitions of gender of men, women, and in many, many countries, especially in Asia, there are official legal categories that are neither man nor woman. And anyway, so because I had been in the academy at that point for decades, and the basic ideas about the historical contingency of truth and the basic idea of things like race and gender being social constructs, those basic ideas were within the academy mainstream and normal. And if I had appeared at any academic conference and had said what I said on Joe Rogan's podcast, people would have considered it sort of trite and boring and ordinary. Now, I have been also a major public critic of most of the politics in the academy, and simply the ways people in the academy have conducted research and made arguments. But on those two basic points, the contingency of truth and the socially constructed nature of race and gender, I have agreed. I still, to this day, think that those are highly valuable ways of thinking about the world that have certainly changed the way I have thought about the world and the way that I speak about the world. And I also think, and this is what I've been trying to argue, which is very different. I don't know of any postmodernist philosopher who has said this, but I am the one who has argued that people with particular politics and particular libertarian type politics can actually tremendously benefit from some of these key insights in postmodernism. That a political commitment to personal freedom and liberty is entirely consistent with these ideas that the postmodernists have raised. And I will talk about that in a moment, but especially in the course at the Academy. We will fully develop the ways in which postmodernist ideas can assist or abet or buttress many of the ideas of people who are small L libertarian. So I've been subject to quite widespread criticism by people who are not of the Academy. Joe Rogan's listeners, generally speaking, are not of universities, which is what is their great virtue, in my view. But this particular idea really hit a nerve. I think it's because I raised it in 2017, which is when the trans movement had just sort of begun, and the reaction against it was taking off as well. And I think people assumed that I was one of the blue hair trans activists, which I am not. And in fact, was it 2 weeks ago? I did an entire video here on Unregistered Live, a live stream devoted to that very topic of how the trans movement actually has been a repudiation of postmodernism. So this is a little complicated, and my position on postmodernism is, I suppose, unique. I'm not even consistent, as I said, with other people who are identified as postmodernists in these various ways. So I've been making a political argument about its utility for those who are interested in freedom. And I've also been arguing with all my might to correct many of the things that have been said since 2017, since I appeared on that show, about postmodernism publicly, in particular, what Jordan Peterson has said about it. And Jordan Peterson, of course, I think has been the most famous critic of what he calls postmodernism. And I say that because having listened to him for many, many hours discuss this topic, it is very clear that he has not read much of anything of postmodernist literature and knows very little about what these thinkers have said. And his characterizations of postmodernist arguments are caricatures or worse. They don't comport with anything that I read or with what colleagues have read in postmodernist literature. And so tonight, I'll take a small step in that direction to correct some of the sort of weird ideas, I would say, and sort of surprising ideas about what postmodernism is. But in the course, of course, we will do a full job of that. So go to unregisteredacademy.com and sign up now. So let's look at just a few of the antecedents of the postmodernist movement, which most people identify as emerging after World War II, and in particular in the 1960s and 70s. So the French philosophers that are the best known of this group would be Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Baudrillard, Lyotard, et al. And these are all post-war figures who gained fame and notoriety and started to influence the way people think in the academy, as I said, in the 60s and 70s. But the antecedents are important and usually overlooked. Major intellectual antecedents, or precedents, you could say, in the 100 or so years prior to the emergence of postmodernism proper. So we will look tonight at that. And again, in the course, we will do a complete analysis, textual analysis of the major postmodernist thinkers that I just named. But tonight we'll be looking at, as I said, their predecessors, the people who made interventions, intellectual interventions, I think, that led to or made possible the full postmodernist critique of the late 20th century. So let's begin with the beginning. And most people who are historians of postmodernism begin with this guy. Friedrich Nietzsche, very famous philosopher, German philosopher of the 19th century. And I begin the story of postmodernism always with him, as do several other scholars of this movement. So the question of objectivity is often raised, especially in journalism. I mean, I think that's where it comes up the most often. We're most often confronted with that idea that there is this thing called objectivity. And Nietzsche Nietzsche takes a hammer to that concept with this assertion, which is what it is. I would say it's not exactly an argument. And he writes in aphorisms. So it's a little tricky sometimes reading Nietzsche, but I think this aphorism is quite clear in its approach to the question of objectivity. What is objectivity, or is there such a thing? And here's what he has to say, not about journalists, but about philosophers, which in the 19th century, philosopher was sort of a broader term, a catch-all term for people that we would now call journalists or public intellectuals. So that's who he's really talking about here, people who are public intellectuals. So he says this in his book, Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886. He says, "It has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely, the confession of its originator, and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography." In other words, they're not speaking or writing the truth. They're writing about themselves. They are speaking for themselves. They are speaking their own, to use a current term, their own truth, not a universal truth. Then he says, and moreover, that the moral or immoral purpose in every philosophy has constituted the true vital germ out of which the entire plant has always grown. Indeed, to understand how the most incomprehensible metaphysical assertions of a philosopher have been arrived at, it is always well and wise to first ask oneself, what morality do they or does he aim at? Accordingly, I do not believe that an impulse to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but that another impulse, here as elsewhere, has only made use of knowledge and mistaken knowledge as an instrument. So the first thing to understand about a philosopher, a public intellectual, a journalist, and this is what he's saying in the last two sentences, is what moral philosophy, moral framework do they come from? Because for them, the truth is delivered out of that morality. One's truth conceptions always flow from one's morality and one's own biography. So he's simply dismissing, even laughing at, I would say, mocking the notion that philosophers or anyone has access to something like a universal truth. They have only access to their own personal truth. And this is developed at great length in the rest of Nietzsche's work. And again, we have a course on Nietzsche himself, which I highly recommend as well. But we also include this in the course on postmodernism. But this was kind of cracking open the modernist idea flowing from the Enlightenment of the 16th and 17th centuries that was widely held among intellectuals in the 19th century, that there was this sort of objective, absolute truth out there, and that people like philosophers and scientists can go find it and should go find it, and then they should go speak it. The search for absolute universal truth was the mission of philosophers and scientists in the 19th century. And Nietzsche, as I said, put his fist right through it. Now let's look at another attempt to overthrow that worldview of objective moral goods. And this comes from this group of cultural anthropologists at Columbia University who were operating in the early 20th century, but became well known in the 1920s and 1930s. Franz Boas was kind of the leader of this anthropological movement, this intellectual movement. Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead were his most famous students. Margaret Mead, I'm sure most people watching this will have heard of her. She did the famous studies of the islands in the South Pacific and found, most famously, most importantly, very, very different attitudes and beliefs about gender. from island to island. On some islands, she would find strong patriarchies. On others, she would find strong matriarchies. On some, there would be 3 or 4 different genders. And this caused quite a stir, quite a lot of controversy, kind of similar to my experience on Joe Rogan's podcast. Margaret Mead received a huge amount of criticism simply for making that observation, but these anthropologists developed those observations, that data that they found, studying various different disparate cultures around the world. They developed it into an argument which is now called cultural relativism, which I would say is a second leg of postmodernist thinking. So they're very important in the history of this intellectual movement. So here's Franz Boas writing in 1887. It is my opinion that the main object of ethnological collections should be the dissemination of the fact that civilization is not something absolute, but that it is relative, and that our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as our civilization goes. So what we think of as good and true and right and just are very different from what is considered to be right and true and just in other countries, in other civilizations. Yet the people in those other civilizations, they usually think the same way that we do, which is that we are right and true and correct and morally good, that our worldview is absolutely correct. People who live in Saudi Arabia, people who live in Iran and China and North Korea and Venezuela have very different views about truth, reality, gender. Who is a man and who is a woman? They have different views about even that. What is God? Where is God? What does God do? Is God present in the world? Yes, they believe that. Many of them do, of course. They believe that to be objectively true, and most people in the West think that they are primitive morons. They're simply wrong. We are the ones who are right. So Boas, again, is saying this it simply contradicts the facts. Having studied, as anthropologists do, they study different cultures, and having simply done that, they found an infinite array, an infinite diversity of truth claims in different cultures. Ruth Benedict, writing in 1934, laid it out with a little more detail. She says, we do not any longer make the mistake of deriving the morality of our locality and decade directly from the inevitable constitution of human nature. We do not elevate it to the dignity of a first principle. We recognize that morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Morality is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Mankind has always preferred to say it is morally good rather than it is habitual. And the fact of this preference is matter enough for a critical science of ethics. A critical science of ethics, which is what I would call postmodernism, as a matter of fact. But historically, the two phrases are synonymous. How societies and civilizations have organized themselves over generations, creating cultures and cultural norms, rules of behavior, those rules of behavior that are present and dominant and definitive in every civilization, have usually been called, or almost always called by those civilizations, morally good. The way we do things, the way we think about things is morally good. The way other people think about things is morally bad. And of course, this has also led to a great number of wars of conquest. People in the United States in particular, but also Great Britain and France and other European nations, made the argument that our civilization, our way of life, is vastly superior to the ways of life of the people who live in places like Iran and North Korea and Saudi Arabia, etc. And it is our duty to uplift them to our level. They are living immoral lives, incorrect lives, savage, barbaric lives, because they don't know the truth. But we do, and we will deliver it to them. So I would say that the cultural anthropologist intervention against cultural absolutism was maybe the first major and important intervention against imperialist thinking. Imperialist thinking. Ever since they made these observations and then their subsequent arguments, there has been a philosophical, deep basis, an ethical basis to challenge imperialist thinking. But it's also, as I said, I consider it to be one of the principal legs of the postmodernist movement that emerges right after this. Another massive event, I would say, in the history of the postmodernist thinking was the publication of this book. I don't have the year here. It's 1962. Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn began as a physicist, but then transitioned to become a historian of science. And he never identified it as a postmodernist, and I think had some criticism of postmodernist thinking. But this is widely considered to be one of the most important moves made by intellectuals that contributed to postmodernist thought. And this was fairly early. Foucault's books were published. His first book was published the same year. Derrida was largely unknown at this point. Kuhn was an American also. But in this book, he takes a look at the history of science, and in particular, revolutions in science, right? Wholly new ways of thinking about the universe that have come about periodically, right? There have been many, many scientific revolutions, new discoveries, new theories, and all of a sudden everyone believes this new set of ideas, new set of facts about the truth of nature, the universe, human beings. So Kuhn says, actually, there are periods in which he calls there's normal science, and then there's periods of what he calls extraordinary science. And those are the moments when people change their minds, when scientists and philosophers, and then usually authorities, change their minds about large things that were large concepts or ideas that were held as fact before. So he looks at one particular scientific revolution, a very important one, the Copernican revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries. So, as I'm sure most, if not everyone watching this know, prior to Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, prior to that era, prior to the 15th and 16th centuries, basically everyone, every scientist, every philosopher, every religious scholar, every government official, every authority, certainly in Europe and much of the world, believed that the sun revolved around the earth. That was just known. That was a fact. That was a fact for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. The sun orbits the earth. The earth is at the center of the universe. That was a fact. And if you said anything otherwise to challenge that, you would be mocked, scorned, or, as Galileo was after Copernicus, sentenced to house arrest for the rest of your life. Because what he did was, Galileo following Copernicus, they challenged what was the truth. The truth, circa 1500, was that the sun travels around the earth. Well, of course, we all know that after Copernicus writes this new model in which the earth travels around the sun, He wrote that right before he died, so the Copernican revolution didn't really take off until, as I said, Galileo in the next century starts to disseminate this. This is why Galileo was punished by the authorities, because he began the actual revolution. So toward the end of Galileo's life, and then after that, of course, gradually but steadily, more and more and more intellectuals, philosophers, scientists, and government authorities changed their mind. And they began to think that it was ridiculous and stupid and ignorant and savage, in fact, and barbaric to believe that the sun travels around the earth. And of course, they all knew for sure now. Now, of course, it is the truth that, and has been for several centuries now, that it's the other way around. The truth is that the earth travels around the sun. So even, Thomas Kuhn is saying here, even scientific truth has always been, at least until now, historically contingent. Never absolute, never eternal. Name a scientific truth that is eternal, that has not been challenged, overturned, modified, revised. Even gravity. You can look it up. Look at what scientists have done to the theory of gravity just in the last 2 years. All sorts of new discoveries about how things are moving in outer space, new theories about the ways in which gravity works. They are constantly revising even that, which many people consider to be the most fundamental of the scientific truths. And you can keep going. You can think about other scientific truths of not even that long ago, let's say just 100 years ago. 1925. In 1925, just 100 years ago, what were the scientific truths about race and gender? Now, some people watching this might still believe in those, quote, truths about race and gender, and that's just fine. But again, our society, our civilizations, changed their minds about the truth about race and gender. It is almost universally accepted that Black people and white people are born essentially the same biologically, and that there are no different races, biological races of people, human beings, et cetera, et cetera. It was the truth that Black people were physically suited to slavery. That was the truth in the 19th century. Widely accepted, even by most Black people. And I could keep going, right? You can, all of you, everybody watching this right now can think of probably infinite scientific truths that are no longer considered to be true. And so it is, I would say, highly arrogant to believe that now, this year, this time, this age, and us, the people living in this time and now, we are the first ones to find eternal truth. Oh, we have it right. Everyone before us had it wrong. The people who believed in the sun traveling around the earth and that Black people needed to have their heads measured to determine what jobs they should be given, etc. And I could go on and on and on and on and on. We look at almost every previous scientific truth claim as almost farcical now, or at the very least, just wrong. So the idea that we now have arrived at the truth is arrogant and also, I would say, unscientific, because most scientists who write about this stuff, who think about this stuff, say that they will never and have never arrived at the truth, that science is always about skepticism and questioning and asking and testing every truth claim that comes along, not accepting any one of them as being permanent and eternal and right forever, because you know what? We are not God. So we will develop this and much more of the arguments made by the postmodernist movement of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and present day in our course at Unregistered Academy. It's called Postmodernism: An Introduction. It is the most popular course I have taught, and I'm very much looking forward to that. It begins next Tuesday. Actually, it's a one-day course. It's a special one-session course. So sign up for the Academy, or you can purchase the course individually. And I hope to see you on Tuesday, or you can watch it by streaming video after that as well. I do think it will help many people who have particular politics understand different ways of defending their politics and advancing their politics. And I also think, I'm quite sure, in fact, that it will help to disabuse many people of the claims made about postmodernism in the media recently. So I hope to see you in class. Hope to see you at the Academy. Go to unregisteredacademy.com and sign up now. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.